Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. Here's a guess. Everybody has heard of Fat Leonard. You don't know who he is, but you know that there is a guy called Fat Leonard, and he's been in the news recently. He's a remarkable looking figure. He is indeed fat. He's very large, and he was involved in one of the great scandals in U.S. military naval history. And now we have a book on Fat Leonard by one of America's leading investigative reporters. Craig Whitlock is at the Washington Post. He's the author of a much acclaimed book on Afghanistan, and he has a new book out on the great, or perhaps the not so great, Fat Leonard, how one man bribed, built, and seduced the U.S. Navy. It took him 10 years. And I'm thrilled that Craig is joining us now from his home just outside Washington, D.C. in Maryland. Craig, Fat Leonard, tell us briefly who this guy was or is.
So Fat Leonard's real name is Leonard Francis, and he's a Malaysian citizen. He was also a defense contractor for the U.S. Navy. And what he did for 25 years is his company provided port services whenever a U.S. Navy warship or other countries' Navy ships pulled into port. Whenever they needed food, water, fuel, tugboats, you name it, his company provided it from Singapore to Vladivostok, Russia, to Sydney, Australia, Hong Kong, any of these major ports and minor ports throughout Asia and the Western Pacific.
I got to ask you, Craig, because the name is so brilliant, Fat Leonard. Who came up with the name? Was he always known as Fat Leonard, or did this come once the scandal came out?
No, he was, I'll tell you a little story. I used to cover the Pentagon as a beat reporter for the Washington Post. And shortly after Leonard was arrested in 2013, there was a short Newswire article that came out about this Navy contractor named Leonard Francis had been arrested on bribery charges, along with one U.S. Navy officer and a federal agent for the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, or NCIS. I was curious about this because it's very unusual for a Navy officer and a federal agent to be arrested on bribery charges. And I was wandering the corridors of the Pentagon and bumped into a Navy officer I knew. I said, "Do you know anything about this case? Who's this Leonard Francis guy?" And the officer got a big smile on his face and said, "Oh, you mean Fat Leonard?" And I said, "No, really, is that his nickname?" And he says, "Everybody in the Navy knows Fat Leonard." So, I can smell a good story and knew that was definitely destined to be one. And so to answer your question, no, he is widely known as Fat Leonard. He doesn't like the nickname.
He's a big guy. I mean, he's not just fat, but he's enormous. How tall is he?
Well, he's 6'3", but his weight has fluctuated over the years. At one point, when he got the nickname in the 1990s, he was 500 pounds, believe it or not. And in the Navy, they would sometimes have to lift him up onto the deck of a ship with a hoist, like he was a piece of heavy equipment. That's how big he was.
That's why you have those big naval ships, I guess, so that Fat Leonard can get aboard. I mean, I'm laughing, Craig, but should I be laughing? I mean, is this really the inanity, the absurdity of the U.S. military with the Fat Leonard moniker, or is there something more serious about this story?
Well, frankly, both. He's an amusing character, but the serious side of this is that, frankly, Leonard's weight, I think, caused many people in the U.S. military and the Navy to underestimate just how smart he was as a criminal. This is one of the world's greatest con men, and they really saw him as this jolly fat guy who threw a lot of parties with fancy dinners and Cuban cigars and women. And he came across as very patriotic. He wore neckties with U.S. flags on them. They saw him as harmless, and yet behind all that, he was this criminal mastermind who not only was gouging the U.S. government, but he was slowly accumulating blackmail material on dozens and dozens of U.S. Navy officers, finding out their weaknesses and how to cultivate them as forced or unforced moles and informants. So the nickname, you laugh, and it's true. He's a humorous guy, but that, I think, caused people in the U.S. military to really underestimate him as a threat.
And there was no big power, some evil big power, Venezuela or the Russians or the Chinese or Al-Qaeda behind all this. It's all run through this brilliantly corrupt figure called Fat Leonard. Is that correct?
As far as we know, but I have to add an asterisk to that. So again, he was a Malaysian defense contractor who made his business with the U.S. Navy. But over the years, he recruited 10 U.S. Navy officers to leak him military secrets over a period of 7 years. And that's really astounding. I mean, there's really no parallel for this in the modern history of espionage, to have one foreign agent recruit 10 different U.S. military officers to willingly hand over classified information. That's pretty stunning. And the information was the movement of U.S. warships and submarines throughout Asia and the Pacific, in a part of the world where the United States' biggest adversaries are China, Russia, North Korea. So Leonard had all this classified information over a period of 7 years, and it was unclear what was he doing with this. Now, he says he never sold it to the Chinese or the Russians, but he also didn't protect it very well. And to this day, the Pentagon isn't sure if the Chinese were able to hack into Leonard's unprotected computer systems or not. And just to give you an example, Leonard's IT manager, and this is going to sound like a joke, but his IT manager in Singapore was a man of Chinese descent who played golf with Chinese military officers, right? So the Chinese were clearly interested in Leonard Francis's connections with the U.S. Navy. They had him on their radar. It would have been fairly easy for them to either hack into his systems and obtain this classified information, or just as worryingly, they could have obtained a lot of the blackmail material he kept on U.S. Navy officers, whether compromising photographs of them with prostitutes or of them accepting bribes and gifts. So to this day, we don't know who else might have it, but Leonard says he never sold it willingly or intentionally.
Well, I'm not sure if we should ever believe anything that Fat Leonard says. It sounds like a fictional character created a combination of early Graham Greene and late John le Carré. Kind of Philby and Burgess and McLean rolled into one fat fellow, one fat, brilliantly happy fellow who managed to corrupt the entire U.S. Navy.
It is an amazing character, but in this case, truth really is stranger than fiction. And it took me 10 years to report and write this book, the full story, because the U.S. Navy tried so hard to sweep it under the rug. The U.S. Justice Department, likewise, they prosecuted about 36 individuals. But, the fact that this involved more than 1,000 people in the U.S. Navy and the U.S. military who were under investigation at one point, and 90 admirals who had all had interactions with Leonard over the years. It's pretty stunning, the number of people caught up in this. And it took me 10 years to get to the bottom of it and tell the full story from beginning to end of how Leonard was able to infiltrate the U.S. Navy, not just corrupt it, but infiltrate it.
Yeah, again, it's a shame Kubrick and other 60s filmmakers are dead. We could make it into Dr. Strangelove and the Manchurian Candidate. Does Fat Leonard, does he have any ideology apart from self-interest? Is he anti-American? Does he resent American power?
Not at all. He's very pro-American. And to this day, Leonard sort of feels betrayed. He's in jail in San Diego, California, waiting to be
He's probably watching this. Fat Leonard, if you're watching, congratulations.
Well, you laugh, but he has this enormous ego. He loves the media coverage, and he feels betrayed, though. He feels that his company did a good job, even though they ripped off U.S. taxpayers, that his company did a reasonably good job of servicing Navy ships, and he is very pro-American, or was. And, he saw himself as American in his heart, even though he was a Malaysian citizen. As a teenager, he grew up, he watched The Godfather, he loved Elvis and Fleetwood Mac and American football. So he could talk American to these Navy officers, and he doesn't even have much of an accent. He sounds like an American. So this was another.
Really look like one. I mean, although America, I mean, I don't want to stereotype, of course. Americans tend to be a little overweight too, although not always 500 pounds. Where did all the money go? On girls and food?
Some of it, a lot of it went into Leonard's pockets, but this was the key to his business success was, a Navy ship would come in for a port visit. He could gross a few $1 million in a few days off his port services. And then he would spend, he could spend $100,000 on dinners and women and other gifts. But to him, that was a small price to pay, $50,000 or $60,000, $70,000 for a port visit to entertain U.S. Navy officers when he's grossing several $1 million. To him, that was good business.
I mean, if Fat Leonard had shown up in Silicon Valley and got involved in a startup, would we be applauding his innovation? Is he the kind of brilliant entrepreneur who may have broken the law, but actually reflects unusual innovation?
I think he was a brilliant criminal entrepreneur. The way he infiltrated the Navy and got people to look the other way, he was really smart in figuring out the Byzantine federal contracting process and the U.S. Navy military bureaucracy. He hired people to teach him how contracting worked. He hired a public affairs officer at the U.S. Pacific Fleet to be his own public affairs officer, right? He did this on the sly. He hired people to teach him how to write emails in a fashion that U.S. Navy admirals would understand the lingo. So he was very smart about this. And you mentioned Silicon Valley. Leonard actually did take a trip to Silicon Valley, to Palo Alto, to try and hire a retired 4-star Navy admiral working at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He wanted to hire him to be his chief lobbyist in the United States. It didn't work out, but you laugh, but Leonard was comfortable in those kind of atmospheres.
Yeah, I think fat people at Stanford have frowned on. Maybe that's where he wasn't successful, though. And again, I don't mean to turn this into a joke, because obviously it isn't. But in today's Silicon Valley world, where military contracts and the militarization of technology and AI become more and more central in digital innovation, this is an important story and a warning as well, isn't it, Craig?
Well, it is. And again, Leonard Francis, over all these years, he was able to get 10 U.S. military officers to leak him classified information. There's nothing like that. There's no moderate foreign power that's been able to accomplish something like that.
Yeah, I mean, we did. We've done shows on, what was his name, the CIA informer Olds. What's his name? Old. Who was the
Aldrich Ames, maybe.
Yeah. So and he outdoes him.
Well, he does, in the sense that to be able to recruit, it'd be one thing to get one military officer to leak you classified information, but over 7 years, he got 10 to do it. And, that's in the military. You have to understand the whole culture is you protect classified information. You don't leak it to anyone outside the government, anyone with outside of clearance. They have this enormous multi-billion-dollar counterintelligence architecture set up. And yet Leonard Francis was literally able on some occasions to stroll onto a U.S. naval base in Japan and get Navy officers to hand him over discs with classified information on it. And he'd stroll back out. It was so easy for him to crack the system and get this classified information. It's kind of mind-blowing. To this day, it gets to his charm, that he was this rogue villain, but he could play hardball when he needed to. Once he got people to accept his fancy meals, the prostitutes, or cash, he had them over a barrel. These Navy officers who were on his payroll called him boss, and it wasn't ironic. They meant it. They had to call him boss. Yes, boss. What do you need, boss? And he would say, I need the classified ship schedules. I need the admiral's internal emails. I need this, that. And they would say, yes, boss. And they would carry out his orders. And to have a foreign citizen whose allegiances are kind of uncertain, to have that kind of power is again, really mind-blowing.
Have you sold the movie rights on this, Craig? Because this has to be made into a major Hollywood movie. Has to be.
Not yet, but I think it should be. Now, the funny story.
I should take 10% of it, because any agents watching, I'm sure we're going to drive up the price. Does he Does he have blood on his hands? You mentioned that they called him boss. How did he threaten them? Did he blackmail them?
Well, he let them know he could, right? So by the time they would take these bribes, or he'd have photos of them in compromising positions, they had to do what he wanted. And a lot of these Navy officers were so stupid, they didn't see Leonard again as a threat, so they fell for it. And then only belatedly did they realize that he had compromising material or dirt on them. And at that point, it kind of dawned on them that they would have to do what he said. And he didn't have to overtly threaten, although sometimes he did. He said, "You will do this if you value your career," or "I will make bad things happen to you." But and they would click their heels and salute. And he knew how to use that stick when he needed it.
Well, you said it, not me, Craig, that naval officers are so stupid. Maybe not all of them, but certainly a number of them.
The ones who fell for him are definitely.
But there were, what, more that you said, more than 100?
Almost 1,000. So I'll give you an example. And there's no way to categorize this as anything but stupidity. There was a naval intelligence officer, right, who later became an admiral at the Pentagon in charge of naval intelligence. He liked to party with Fat Leonard. He'd go to his dinners. Leonard took him to a members-only sex club in Bangkok. And according to Leonard, he provided...
I bet that wasn't a hard place to find.
No, I don't think it was. But Leonard had a membership, and he took the Navy officers there. But this was an upscale one that cost, membership might cost $10,000 or something. But on one occasion, Leonard provided this officer with a Mongolian prostitute, and the officer gave his business card to the prostitute that said, "Here's my name. I'm a Navy intelligence officer." And even the prostitute gave the card to Leonard. And afterward, and Leonard couldn't believe this officer was so dumb. Why are you compromising yourself? This woman could blackmail you. And so Leonard had to lecture the officer that you have to be more discreet. This could get us in trouble. After Leonard was arrested and this got out, the Secretary of the Navy at the Pentagon couldn't believe that an intelligence officer would be so dumb as to accept prostitutes. But to give your business card, it's like, I don't know how to explain that other than sheer stupidity.
Well, I want to take a break, Craig, and I want to come back and talk in all seriousness about what this tells us about not just the Navy, but the U.S. military. They're the last group of people to even have business cards. I don't think they realize that business cards died out about 20 years ago. But I want to talk, Craig, in all seriousness about how incompetent perhaps this reflects, or what degree of incompetence this suggests about the Navy and perhaps the broader U.S. military. You're an expert. I want to remind everyone that brilliant guests like Craig Whitlock are brought to us because of our friends at Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics. Excellent new publication, edited by my friend in DC. And I'm going to do a short video of Liberties, and then we'll be back with Craig Whitlock to talk more about the U.S. military and the Navy and, of course, Fat Leonard. Don't go away, anyone.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Craig Whitlock, one of America's leading investigative reporters. He has an important new book out. It's entertaining on one level and deeply troubling on another. Fat Leonard, How One Man Bribed, Built, and Seduced the U.S. Navy. In the first part of the show, Craig, you told us about this Fat Leonard character, a Malaysian contractor who bribed successfully 1,000 U.S. naval officers. One of them he took to a high-end brothel in Bangkok, hired a Mongolian prostitute, gave the prostitute his business card. Doesn't reflect very well on the U.S. military. Suggests to me, Craig, a bureaucratization. Is that fair? What's happening in the U.S., especially in the Navy, to enable a man like Fat Leonard?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Just to clarify, there were 1,000 people under investigation at one point. Doesn't mean they all took bribes from Leonard. They all weren't
Could be
prosecuted.
more for all we know, right?
Well, it could be, but there were certainly, it just gives you a sense of the scope of the number of people who came across Leonard and attended his parties over the years. But you brought up the question of competence, and I actually think U.S. military is a very competent organization. They are good at what they do. The U.S.
What
public,
do they do, though?
Well, hold on, I'll explain. So the U.S. public holds them in very high regard. They're the most respected institution in America, certainly more respected than journalists or politicians. But
before everyone reads your book, I think you're going to ruin their reputation.
The reputation won't look so good after reading this book. But I think it was really this sense of entitlement that crept into the U.S. Navy officer corps, at least among a large number of them, that they thought that they were entitled to having these freebies from Fat Leonard, that particularly when they were far away from home after months or weeks at sea, particularly while helping fight wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, that maybe, what was the harm in taking, a $1,000 dinner from Fat Leonard? And if he wanted to give them Cuban cigars or bottles of Dom Perignon or other gifts, what was the harm? But it was a sense of entitlement that he exploited, that these are people who don't make a lot of money in uniform compared to people in Silicon Valley in the private sector. A four-star admiral maybe makes a couple $100,000, but these are people at the top of their profession. If they were in the private sector, they'd make many times more of that. And I think Leonard gave them a taste of that high life, and they felt entitled to it, a shocking number of them. But again, then once he was able to reel them in like a fish, once they went for it a little bit, he'd give them more and more, and soon they were calling him boss.
But Craig, I think you're being a little too generous. I'm sure you know it. These guys went to military school. It's ethics 101, which I assume they take in military school, that you don't take money or girls or gifts from dodgy characters like Fat Leonard. It's not convincing to say, well, they could have made millions in Silicon Valley. So I know you're not really saying this, but even in their minds, they knew they were breaking the law, didn't they?
No question. And you don't need an ethics course to know that it's wrong to take cash bribes from a contractor, right? You don't need an ethics course to know you shouldn't be sleeping with prostitutes provided by a dodgy character like Fat Leonard.
Especially Mongolian ones.
Well, any of them.
And give your business card.
Yeah, right. And yet a shocking number of these Navy officers who had gone to the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, which is highly regarded, again, for having this very strict honor code, where if you so much as cheat on your homework, they will kick you out and you have to pay back your tuition to the U.S. government. So these are people who, that sense of honor and ethics and doing things right was instilled in them from a young age, and yet the wheels came off by the time they went to Asia and came across Fat Leonard. So it does say a lot about deep-seated problems in the culture, because even if there were officers in the Navy who didn't take these bribes or gifts from Leonard, they all knew this was going on to some degree. Maybe they didn't know the extent of it, but it was no mystery. Like I described earlier, everybody in the Navy knew who Fat Leonard was. They knew he was a dodgy character, and yet, they were like a moth being drawn to the flame. They couldn't resist, even though they knew they might get burned.
I've never understood this, Craig. Perhaps you can explain it. You're the author, as I said, of an important book also on the Afghanistan Papers. You've spent 10 years researching this corruption within the U.S. Naval culture. Why do Americans trust their military more than other institutions, more than honest journalists like yourself? I mean, I assume that Fat Leonard never provided you any Mongolian prostitute. And you certainly wouldn't give him your business card if you did. Is this still, we're living in a kind of surreal post-Vietnam culture where America feels guilty about trashing its military?
I don't think it's post-Vietnam so much as post 9/11. That certainly after 9/11, Americans, by and large, the approval ratings for all branches of the U.S. military were sky high. That they saw the U.S. military as protecting them, during the only attack on the U.S. mainland in history, at 9/11. And, over time, that sort of frayed a bit, particularly the last several years, that there's less trust in the U.S. military than there used to be, but it's still far higher than any other institution in America, even higher than the church, than the Catholic Church. But this is something I think the U.S. military has taken for granted a bit, and episodes like this with Fat Leonard certainly undermine that reputation and integrity. And I think this is something the Navy in particular has been very slow to grapple with, the ramifications of losing that public trust. Because when people read a book like this, like they gain a completely different perception and understanding of the U.S. military. They see the dark underbelly of what people are capable of. And this is very different from the spit polished, upright military officers they kind of have in their mind otherwise.
I mean, it's so much dark as seamy, as somewhat distasteful. You talk about the Americans thinking that the U.S. military protected them after 9/11. I'm not convinced of that. They allowed, one way or the other, 12 men with wire cutters to create one of the great PR victories in history. And then they got involved in 2 catastrophic wars in the Middle East. Is there really evidence that Americans should respect their military? What have they ever done for us over the last 25 years?
Well, I think without question that there's hundreds of thousands of people in the U.S. military who are devoted to public service and defending their country. And, our military, it's not based on a draft. It hasn't been since Vietnam. So these people willingly sign up to serve. And I think, no question, the vast majority of them have noble intent and are trying to serve their country. There's certainly a minority, a smaller number, but a substantial number in the Navy who betrayed their country and threw that away and didn't take their military oath to defend the Constitution seriously. And that's what's really troubling. The people who are going to be most upset by this book, and who have been so far, are people who serve in the military and feel betrayed by their fellow shipmates or officers who literally got in bed with Fat Leonard. I think most of them are noble and high-minded and are trying to do the right thing. They're public servants, but what's shocking is the number who, once the lights went out, turned out to be anything but.
We've done lots of shows, Craig, on public service and the way in which the militarized is essentially being ghettoized. The smart kids go to business school or come out to San Francisco and do startups. The less smart kids, the ones you call stupid, go into the military. Does this reflect that? Not so much immorality, but just general stupidity, cluelessness?
Yeah, I'm going to push back on that. Most people I come into in the Navy, these aren't dumb people. These aren't intellectually inferior people. These are people, particularly the ones who go to the Naval Academy and are in the officer corps. These are very accomplished people who are smart. The ones who took Leonard's bribes, who did stupid things, they did stupid things. I can't defend them on those grounds, but these weren't dumb people in general. These are highly accomplished people, but their morals, their ethical standing, their integrity is what they sold out for very little. And that, to me, is the shocking part of all this. But, I certainly don't think people in the military are just dumb and poor people, and the smart people all go to Silicon Valley. I think that's a really wrong perception.
So where are we, Craig, on the investigation? What's going to happen to Fat Leonard? You said he's in jail in San Diego, which is appropriate. It's a naval city, although it's a nice place. I guess he doesn't get to see the city. Has the investigation been concluded, and who's been implicated within the U.S. Navy? How high is this? How high is this crisis going to go? Is this Watergate for the U.S. Navy?
Well, it is, except it's Watergate without the congressional hearings and without most of the information being made public. And that's what took me 10 years, was to get all the files, the investigative files, to find out who was caught up in it. In public, the Justice Department has charged criminally about 36 people, including Leonard, and most of them have served their sentences or time. There's a few people left, including Leonard, waiting to be sentenced. But the investigation itself has been concluded. But again, as I report in this book, it turned out there were 1,000 people came under investigation, including 90 some admirals. The ones who weren't punished, aren't going to be at this point, and most of their names are never going to be made public. The Navy successfully swept this business, this distasteful business, under the carpet. But the big question is, what does happen to Leonard? He did cooperate with the Justice Department for a number of years. He shared all his blackmail files, his compromising material that he had kept, with prosecutors, so they knew who to investigate. So at what point does he go to prison? For how long? It's unclear, but he'll probably be sentenced sometime this summer.
So he's another in the long line of odd American criminals: Bernie Madoff, Sam Bankman-Fried, Fat Leonard. I get the sense, Craig, that you think justice really hasn't been done. Should there have been a more aggressive investigation of the U.S. Navy? Should someone very, very senior in the Navy have been made accountable for this really catastrophic breach of security?
I do think there was a lack of accountability. Now, the Justice Department makes the decisions on who violated federal law, who deserves to be charged as a criminal. And you have all sorts of legal questions, including statute of limitations. A lot of these people were being investigated for things they did with Fat Leonard, 5, 10, 15 years prior, and the statute of limitations had expired. But certainly there wasn't nearly enough public accountability. The Navy hated talking about this case. It would refuse to release.
Understandably, I mean, it's a massive embarrassment to them.
Well, except again, you have to understand the Navy, like the other branches of the military, they really derive their public integrity from having that support of the American people, that sense that they're doing the right thing to defend the country. They have such an enormous power invested in them by the public to wage war, to defend the country. They have to be above reproach. And in this case, they obviously weren't. And my view is there does need to be accountability, particularly in terms of the leadership of the Navy and the Pentagon. Who knew what when? Who was responsible for letting this happen under their nose? How could this go on for so many years? Those are the questions I really get into in the book in terms of who should be held accountable. But in public, the Navy and the Pentagon have done very little of that.
So it's really it's a double scandal then. I mean, you've got the original Fat Leonard scandal, and then the post investigation narrative is also scandalous.
Well, it's like they say in Washington all the time, the scandal is the cover-up more than the original sin. And I think in this case, the original sin was pretty bad, but the cover-up was equally bad. And again, that's why it took 10 years for me as a trained investigative reporter to try and get to the bottom of it.
Did you get to talk to very senior people within any of the branches of the military, particularly the Navy?
I did. And all the interviews in this book, there's more than 100, were on the record. And all the information is based on the record interviews or law enforcement documents and contemporaneous emails, Leonard's communications with people over the years, photographs, copies of his menus for his wild dinner parties. I managed to get my hands on all this primary source material, but I did interview a number of senior officials, and some of them are really angry. They feel betrayed by other officers. And I did also interview a number of people who went to prison, who took bribes from Leonard. And I was surprised how many of them did talk. And none of them had any excuses. Maybe some of them tried to minimize the extent of their crimes, but they admitted what they did was wrong. They admitted they let down their country, and they kind of, some of them shrugged about it. Some of them felt sincerely bad that they were still paying the price. But I think even them, they were trying to understand how this could have gone on as long as it did, largely undetected, and how Leonard was able to accomplish what he did in terms of his crimes.
And what about the political administrations? I mean, Fat Leonard could have been an associate, perhaps, of Donald Trump. He wouldn't have been out of place at Mar-a-Lago. But what about the Biden administration? Can they do anything, the secretaries of the Navy, to address this breach of security, this absurd corruption of the U.S. Navy?
Yeah, so it's important to note that this unfolded under multiple presidential administrations. Most of Leonard's bribery occurred during the Bush administration. His arrest took place when Obama was in the White House. And then some of the investigations happened under Trump, and really were at the tail end under Biden. So you have 4 presidents two from each party, but none of them were eager to own up to this, right? They would appoint secretaries of the Navy, the civilian bosses at the Pentagon, but nobody wanted this on their record. Nobody wanted to take responsibility for this. The other aspect was that Congress was really missing in action. They're the other branch of government.
Surprise, Craig, right? I bet Fat Leonard took some of the congressmen out for
no.
He didn't
take the congressman out, but they just, for whatever reason, Congress was never eager to look into this. And part of that, I'm guessing here, maybe be undue deference to people in uniform, that they didn't want to haul people on the witness stand and grill them on Capitol Hill about what happened. So they were missing in action too.
So is that finally, I mean, you've been very generous with your time, Craig. Is that the lesson here, that we should be less deferential towards the US military, the Navy? Perhaps there's similar scandals in the Air Force and other branches of the military.
Well, I learned this lesson a long time ago, but particularly writing my previous book called The Afghanistan Papers, A Secret History of the War. And in that case, what I was able to document was for the entirety of the war in Afghanistan, that military and civilian leaders in charge of that war were lying to the American public about how things were going, that they weren't telling the truth about it. They told people that the war was going well, that they were making progress, that we were winning, when in fact, in private, they would say, this was not true. They knew the strategy didn't make any sense, that this was an unwinnable war. So certainly the deference, we shouldn't take anything the commanders of the US military, they say, we shouldn't automatically assume they're telling us the truth. We, like in anything with journalism, you check it out. You try and verify if what they're telling you is true or not. And we shouldn't assume that people in the military are leveling with the American people. And that's certainly true in the Fat Leonard case as well.
You talk about truth serum. Did you ever get to talk to Fat Leonard?
Not directly, because he had been arrested by the time I started writing on this book, and he was in custody, and he had to be careful because he was under surveillance. But we did sort of have some interesting back channel communications going on through third parties. And like I said, he's a guy with a big ego, and he liked a lot of this coverage. And in a way, he wants the story to be told about how he hoodwinked.
Do you think he's going to be happy with the book? Is he going to complain? Is he going to sue you?
I don't think he's going to sue me because it's all true. Now, I'm sure there are things he may not like in there, but in general, I think he wants the story to be told about how he pulled one over, how he conned the U.S. Navy. But he also feels that he's had to pay for his crimes. He's going to be sentenced, and he feels that a lot of the people who took his bribes got away with it, and that's not fair. And you can't argue with him on that count.
Is he considered a hero in Malaysia, or at least among some people?
No, I don't think a hero. I don't think anybody holds up Leonard Francis as a hero. I think, certainly as a criminal mastermind, as a criminal genius, you can't help but admire his intelligence to some degree. But I don't think anybody's ever going to hold up Leonard Francis as a hero.
Well, finally, it's a remarkable story of Leonard Francis, otherwise known as Fat Leonard. Craig, you talked about a truth serum. You never actually spoke to the guy. If you did, and you could give him this truth serum to ask him one question that he would have to answer honestly, doesn't sound like the most honest of men, what would it be?
Well, I did get to talk to, I heard what he said. I obtained hundreds of interviews he gave with federal agents who are investigating this case. He cooperated with the Justice Department. He met with them for hours and hours on end, and they took notes or recorded the interviews with him. So I got to hear firsthand and read firsthand the stories he was telling. And I was very careful in this book because he is a dodgy character. I had to back up. I had to have other evidence to verify his claims or his allegations. I didn't print anything just based on Leonard's say-so. There had to be something to corroborate it. So I was very careful about that. I think that's very important with somebody like him. But, the question I would ask is, why didn't he just quit while he was ahead? He had a really good business going with the U.S. Navy. His services were generally pretty reliable. It's just he couldn't resist overcharging so much. And if he had just scaled it back a little bit, he probably would have been able to make a fortune indefinitely through his work with the Navy. But it was like he couldn't quite help himself. He had to reach higher and higher and further. And I just, that is something I'd want to ask him is, you could have made a ton of money, but you were just excessive about it. Why? It was almost like he was self-destructive in the end. And that's the kind of thing I'd like to ask him about.
Yeah, it's the old question. It's the same of Madoff and probably Sam Bankman-Fried and so many other criminals. They just didn't know when to stop. Perhaps there was an addictive quality to Fat Leonard's criminality, Craig.
I think that's right. And some people have described that. They said, he was this flashy guy. He loved having Lamborghinis and Rolls Royces and women on his arms. And, he was very flashy. He liked the attention. As one person said, you're not that big, a man that size without some issues, some insecurities. And I don't know if this was what he was addicted to, the wealth and the show and the attention, but certainly that's what did him in the end.
Yeah, I don't know, a man of his size and weight, how would he fit into a Lamborghini?
That's a good question, but he owned some. But he had, for instance, he would get these Land Rovers or Hummers, and he would have them customized so he could have extra space for himself in there. And he had drivers to take him places. But he was a big guy. But I always sort of amazed how much he was flying around Asia. He was constantly on the move in business class or first class, but he would go from Hong Kong to Singapore to Tokyo so he would be the concierge to these Navy officers whenever they're in port to take them out for a good time. And for a man that big, he had a lot of physical stamina. He was up all night for months on end. And I'm amazed in some ways that he's still